I'm Kamerie Gibson. Welcome to the Kamerie Gibson Show, the podcast. I believe that one of the most precious gifts you can share with someone is your story. Pain has purpose and stories can change lives. Your journey to become more inspired and transformed by the lives of those around us starts now. Welcome to the Kamerie Gibson Show, where we talk about transforming our pain into power. And today I have a special, beautiful, extremely talented, and devoted guest with me here today. Her name is Cierra Chenier. Cierra, would you mind introducing yourself to the audience for me, please?
Yes, thank you for that beautiful introduction. My name is Cierra Chenier. I'm born and raised in New Orleans. I'm a writer, historian of Black New Orleans history and culture. My digital platform, Noir Nola, works to preserve the history, the culture of Black New Orleans. So a lot of that is rooted in just various stories through enslavement, stories of resistance, in the face of gentrification in a post-Katrina New Orleans.
Okay, so when you say post-Katrina, what exactly does that mean?
So New Orleanians, our whole lives are divided up by before Katrina, after Katrina. We'll say before the storm or after the storm. So because of such a distinct difference in the two. So pre-Katrina, oftentimes you'll hear us talk about it from a place of neighborhoods, community, just, businesses that used to exist, a certain like spirit in New Orleans that existed. Whereas post-Katrina, that spirit is still there. Those culture, the traditions are still there, but it's a fight to hold on to them. And there are a lot of things that have changed. Neighborhoods have changed. People have been displaced, including my own family and friends. And so there's a distinct difference there in what was before the storm and after the storm. And I was only 9 when Hurricane Katrina hit. And being so young, it's interesting in that my being so adamant about before Katrina, you think you don't even have that much of a memory at 9 years old. But given all the shifts and all the changes, you'll find that a lot of that point of reference is rooted in memory, that cultural memory, and just that desire to want to preserve so much of that identity.
Wow. I remember in 2005, yeah. I think I was 9. Let me do the math real quick.
I don't know, it might have been like 8 or 9.
Okay, let me look it up real quick. I'll be 8. I'm born in 97, so okay, but it was in August 2005.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so girl, Cierra. So I'm teaching some students, right? And they're 17 and 18 now. They're a senior year in high school, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were born in 2005. So they don't even have no
They don't
recollection.
even
See what
know.
I'm talking about? And if we don't talk about it, they won't know. They were born,
Exactly.
they were babies. And so when I put it on the screen, because we were talking about gentrification, my teacher's people's from New Orleans, he was like, y'all got to see what happened. Y'all got to see how it was before. And yeah, they never heard about it. Crazy,
It's crazy. It's
right?
crazy.
So for people who don't know about the hurricane, could you give us some background? Because you were in a documentary series. There have been several documentaries previously about Hurricane Katrina, but what exactly happened?
So in the film Katrina Babies, directed by a friend of mine, Edward Buckles, it was the Katrina story that you never heard or saw before. And there's so many documentaries and films that center, the what happened, the overall gist of when the levees broke. And that was something that really a lot of times people hear, oh, Hurricane Katrina, and think it was a really bad hurricane and New Orleans got destroyed. And really the whole Gulf Coast region got hit pretty badly. What really did New Orleans in specifically was the fact that the levees broke and New Orleans essentially being underwater. And the biggest aspect that, makes Katrina one of the worst, we don't even call it natural, but man-made disasters of our time, is the fact that the government response was so poor. There was such a failure on all ends. And in that response, you essentially saw a predominantly Black city left to die, left to fend for itself. And in Katrina Babies, it takes the angle of like, okay, you know what happened. Here's the stories of the young people who never had the chance to tell their stories because of a lot of the previous angles have been, it's adults, it's a government officials, it's people who were um community leaders and things at that time, but nobody was really talking to the kids. And this story really centers the voice of the youth and elevates it in a way of, we're the ones really grappling with this post Katrina New Orleans now, and myself included, but all of us who were interviewed and were subjects in the film are realizing like, oh, I do have a Katrina story, or like, oh, I'm realizing now nobody ever asked me this. This is my first time sharing, what that experience was even like. So I think Katrina is one of those American stories. It's not just New Orleans, because I always say that being from New Orleans and having experienced Hurricane Katrina is what radicalized me long before some of the national police brutality incidents that we've seen, and things that now it's kind of like I feel like people in New Orleans are sitting back and looking like, this how they treat Black people. So it's some of those things where it's like, I think you're in having a better understanding of Katrina, you really have a better understanding of how Black people, the Black experience, and how Black people are treated in America. And through that, we're seeing all kind of environmental impacts from the West Coast to the East Coast, and still in the South, and certainly still New Orleans. So as we're all facing these things from different angles, not one aspect is always to question, how are we centering and prioritizing the communities that are directly impacted? And even within that, are we talking to the children?
No, absolutely, absolutely. And you saying that it radicalized you before anything else. Something that traumatic is like but I'm not gonna say that like you're not unique though to your own story, because not everybody can handle that and turn that pain into power. Like I said earlier in the introduction, you channeled that into I'm gonna make sure I bring all that with me. I document these stories. I let our voices be heard because nobody asked us. Nobody asked me how I felt when I had to leave and change schools or leave my home when I was a child. When as a child, especially, with some Black families, like, you just gotta go with it. There's no questioning anything. You just
Yeah.
gotta adapt. So that's very powerful. And absolutely, even with the police brutality and the pandemic, I wonder how these young kids are gonna, like, grow up to become when they talk about the mask, or
Mhm.
seeing people on the internet get murdered and stuff, like,
Mhm.
all through TikTok. We gotta make sure
Yeah,
we include young people's perspective.
absolutely.
So what does noir and NOLA mean to you? And what type of work are you channeling through there?
So I created this in 2017. It really came from a place of frustration, honestly. It was kind of like my way of like throwing my hands up, like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what I have the power to do, but I like to write and I consider myself to be good at writing. So this is what I have to work with. And this came at a time where um I was seeing so many changes in New Orleans. And, we are a city that's slow to change, to be real. We have traditions that are literally as old as the city itself. We move, the big is easy. We move at a certain pace. And there's so much, I think, rage that I hold in so much of what was lost and that was changed after Katrina, in addition to some of the systemic issues that impact our communities all over, but within New Orleans in terms of the violence. So seeing, people close to me losing their lives, I'm seeing neighborhoods change. I just kind of got to a point where I was like, how do I freeze time a bit? And I don't know what the one solution is, but I do know that there is a lack of value of our lives in all of this. So how do I create something where I'm constantly reminding us of the value of our lives? And to me, that was through history. I always, I grew up in a household rooted in Black history. That's something that I always knew. These oral traditions, these family histories, and these stories of Black New Orleans. And I kind of just really just started to dive internally into the stories that I felt like we were supposed to learn in our classrooms, stories that we were supposed to learn, in mass media on a national level, and really starting to understand the role that Black New Orleans has had in the city, but also just across the country and across the world. And being able to reassert that and reminding us of like that value of our lives and saying, you know what, we have a place in our home and we have to fight for our home, and here's why. So it really was just rooted in that need to want to just hold on to those things.
Absolutely, I love that. Is there a type of work for that, like historical preservation, or is there like a lane?
Historical preservation, writing, cultural memory. Hmm.
Nice, nice. Okay, for sure. So, where did you go to school? What did you major in? For people who want to, do
Hmm.
similar work to you.
So I went to LSU, Louisiana State University. I majored in political science and African American studies. And it's interesting because at LSU, I was taking a English course where we had to center our community, whatever that meant to us. And I remember just being like, I don't know, I'm not like involved in like athletics or anything. I mean, I'm part of like the Black organizations. I don't know, like how am I defining community? And then when I really thought about it, I was like, my community is Black New Orleans. So then you had to write a almost like a love letter in a sense to that community and share it with the professor. And she was actually from New Orleans as well, white woman. And what really stood out to me was when she read it, she said, I'm from New Orleans and there's some things that you wrote in here. She's like, I don't know anything about this. She was like, this is unique. This is something that I've never heard of. So it kind of like set the spark of, oh, this truly is like a exclusive, like, if you're part of this community, you're part of this community. And even if grew up in New Orleans but you are not part of Black New Orleans, you might not even understand all of what I was saying. And interestingly enough, a few months later is when I started Noir Nola, and I operated within the framework of that description. So I definitely had like a lot of aha moments during my time there.
But that's really cool. And you were able to educate someone who, was from another community but was from the same
Right,
city, I guess.
right,
Really
right.
good. Okay, so you were involved with the Black Student Union. Is that what it
Mm-hmm.
was? Okay, so you were also president there as well.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so talk about that for people who don't know about BSU. If you went to an HBCU, I don't know if they have BSUs there. I went to an HBCU and also a PWI, so I know about
Mhm.
both. What is that like?
Yeah, so LSU was a PWI with I think our class was the largest Black class during that time. And I think at this point now, all the class after are also the largest Black class. So I guess it's increasing. But I went with a lot of people that I knew from New Orleans. It was kind of like it's the state school. Like we all going to Baton Rouge. It was only an hour away from New Orleans. And I'm New Orleans girl, so I had to be close. I was coming home every weekend. So it was interesting. I joined the Black Student Union when I was a freshman, and I became the president. I want to say my junior or senior year of the Black Student Union, and then also the Black Leadership Council, and that was just basically like a organization that gathered all the Black organizations. So we were able to do these different like real talks that were centered on colorism and hip hop and issues that might have been going on campus. And just being able to kind of like find that space there, and also in majoring in African American studies, I was able to take these courses that I just feel like really broadened and really, really enhanced the interest that I already had. I might have been aggravated all day going to whatever algebra or whatever biology class, but when I got to race relations, I was good. So I say all the time, and a lot of times people think the humanities or African American studies is like, what you gonna do with that? That's not a real major. But I will say that saved me. It really did. I don't know if I would have been able to get through those 4 years had I not taking those courses, and um just within Black Student Union, and being able to just be inspired even by a lot of the conversations and a lot of the subjects that were centered in my courses. We had we had different rallies, like in response to some of the Charlottesville white supremacist protests that were going on. And we were small, but we were mighty. So definitely being able to have that presence on campus, but also just having a safe space, like, honestly.
I feel you. And people who go to PWIs know that. Like, it's really that serious. And girl, when you said aggravated about algebra, like, no.
Use this. I promise I'm not going into this in my career.
Please, girl. And then I was a journalism major like the first 2 years. They had us do statistics to like be able to, show statistics.
All kind of stuff.
Like, please, no. But
Yeah.
saving me, like BSU, the Black Christian Ministries, the Black Scholars Floor, that all saved me as well. But didn't save me enough, girl. I had to get up out of there. I transferred.
No, that's right.
I really could not. And you know what? People were sad. Like, I had my homies, but I'm like, I need to be with, like, I just wanted that experience so bad. Spelman was my dream school. I didn't get accepted. It was what it was.
Mhm.
And with my grades, to be honest, I knew I wasn't going to be able to get back into Spelman,
Mhm.
PWI. So I went to Texas Southern University in Houston, Third Ward, Texas. Yeah, so I had a great time there. Yeah, so I feel you. Okay, so going back a little bit more, what part of New Orleans are you from, and how does it like run, I guess, like y'all's sections down there?
So I'm originally from New Orleans East. It is literally Eastern New Orleans. It's interesting because it is the largest landmass in the city. It's huge. But when you think, most people think of New Orleans and you think of like the French Quarter and downtown, it's ways away from that. And growing up in the East, before Katrina, I always say I felt like I was spoiled by my childhood in a sense, because I grew up where, everybody in the neighborhood was Black, my parents' friends, the people that we knew that might have been sending their kids to the same school as me, who might have, had a few businesses out there. It was all Black people. And not only that, but there was so much access in terms of, we're going to sit down and eat at a restaurant in the East, the grocery stores we're going to, the church that we're going to, the friends' houses that I'm going to, my family all live within like 5-10 minutes away of each other. Where I grew up, my neighborhood was on the side of like the service road. You could see like the interstate. There's an interstate that goes through, connecting New Orleans East to like the neighboring parish. And something that just like always stood out to me as a child was, you're literally able to see the Six Flags amusement park from my neighborhood. So that used to be like down the street. So like if I got good grades on my progress report, we're going to Six Flags. And at one point it was Jazzland before Six Flags took over. And so, there was I remember going to get my first library card at the library up the street. There was just so much there, movie theaters, a mall, and the East got hardest hit, and along with the Ninth Ward during Katrina. And there just has been such a slow recovery in terms of what is priority. And there were a lot of just like surveys and just conversations taking place immediately post Katrina. And mind you, this is at a time when the internet is not what it is now, social media is not what it is now, so everything is through word of mouth. And many families, including mine, just kind of caught wind of, like, they say they're not really trying to rebuild the East, right? Like, and people made very real decisions based on that. Some people stayed and were able to rebuild their homes. Some people were like, well, if it's slow to recover, I'm trying to move back home, so we got to go somewhere else. And New Orleans is a city that is so bound and tied to its neighborhoods. Each neighborhood has its own accent, its own culture. If you grew up uptown, you didn't go downtown. If you grew up downtown, you didn't go uptown. I rarely left the East for certain things, because so much was already right there. And when you disrupt that with something like a hurricane, and there's areas that are slow to recover, you're then moving around in ways that we didn't really move around before. I say all the time, certain neighborhoods or certain areas of New Orleans that I'm in, the most that I've been in them is in my adult life, like it recently, because it's just like, you just kind of stayed where you were because where you were had what you needed, including your family. So, you have that displacement, people moving from outside the neighborhood, but also outside of the city, outside of the state. So, I think so much of growing up in New Orleans East is like why I do what I do, because it's rooted in so much of like a lot of things have changed, and how do we bring back something that was so promising, something that was so necessary to Black New Orleans.
So when you talk about preserving the soul of New Orleans, you're talking about that soul of the Black people that were, well, I mean, the Black soul is the Black soul regardless. Or what do you think? I don't know.
Yeah, I think the soul is tied to the people. So it's like, if we got to preserve the soul, the people have to be there. So if people are being displaced from different areas, in addition to, you have this rapid gentrification coming in that's impacting all of New Orleans, the people have to be here in order for the soul to be here, in order for the culture to be here. So yeah, I think it all ties together.
Yes. What were your dreams as a little girl?
Ooh, interestingly enough, I wanted to be a vet. And it's strange because I think it's just because I wanted a puppy. Because I had that dream died real quick. I was like, oh no, actually this is not what I want to do.
Oh
But
no, no.
that was like one of my very early, like, pre-K, when you had to dress up career day thing. I wanted to be a vet, but over time, as I started to like really dabble into what I enjoyed and really was interested in, I feel like I didn't think that there was a title for what I truly wanted to do. So that was always the struggle. Like, I really had to find that, and pretty much like create what I felt like I didn't see. Of course, there's been so many Black New Orleans writers and historians throughout time that I'm able to follow in the footsteps of. So being able to like kind of step into that and do it in a way where it's our generation, it's digital, it's, how do I make people even want to care about some of this stuff, is really a blessing. But I think for the longest I was just like, I don't think there's really a name for what I'm trying to do. I know, uh I remember like during my time at LSU and was bouncing around majors only to end up in the same majors that I finished in. And I remember telling my parents, like, I don't know. And they were like, okay, so like, what do you love? I was like, I love Black people and I love New Orleans. So, it worked out in the end.
That is so real, girl. That's so real. And that's enough though. That was enough.
That was enough. Yes.
It was enough, girl. I feel you. Okay, so when you say get people to care about it, I know what that feels like. Sometimes I'll be talking about like, white supremacy, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, all types of stuff like that. And they're like, what? Like, why are you talking about this? Or why do you always gotta be so deep, or whatever? What has been like your experience like with your peers and this type of, love and passion? Do the people around you share the passion for this type of work, this information, or
So thankfully, I find that in many ways, I feel like I was kind of this person before I really knew or could verbalize it. The things that I'm writing about are not very different from the things that I had interest in or might have been talking about at the lunch table or going on a rant about on Twitter or whatever. So I feel like, there's some people who, if they've known me since I was in eighth grade, because it really was like as young as that, then you've kind of seen it comes as no surprise. And thankfully, in doing so, something that I felt was kind of isolating for me when I was younger was, and I'm sure you experienced this as well, is like you might be that person, but you might, some people are like, you're doing too much. Why does this matter? Like, everything is not about race. Yes, it is. Like, all of these things. So it's interesting that now it's like I'm glad to have built like a gradual audience in a way of like okay, now I see what you was talking about. And even then, like, I didn't necessarily have the language to fully communicate what I was trying to say. Like, but now I do. So now it's like we're kind of in a place where it's like, okay, now I see. And there's also just so many like-minded people that I'm around now, and there's just such a big like artist and creative scene in New Orleans where no matter what your medium is, so much is still rooted in like we're holding on to this place. And no matter what way that you're doing it. So I'm lucky to be in this era, this renaissance, so to speak, of New Orleans, where we're kind of just all on the same page, no matter what the medium or the tool may be. My tool is history, but for somebody else it may be uh film, it may be graphic design, it may be fashion, like, but I think because everybody's kind of like on the same mindset of like what's at stake, we're able to move at a similar pace, and people get it, and thankfully people appreciate it.
Yes, people are really starting to appreciate it, and I'm glad. I wanted to say that because I'm like, if I feel like that, I know she has had to feel like that. And
Yeah.
people always would do. I felt like people would try to eliminate me from the conversation, the argument, the debate by saying it's not always about race, because yes, it is, and
Yes, it
everything
is.
on top of it. We did not even create it. So when white people usually would say that to me, or some Black or Latino people, I'm like, do your research. You don't even know what
Yes.
you're talking about, you
Yes.
know.
Yes.
But yeah, so what do you think has been like the most difficult challenge for you just throughout all of this
Um,
development you are too?
I think the heaviness of it all. I think like the reality is my reasoning for doing this work is also tied to my identity. It's tied to my survival. Like I'm not outside of the community that I'm always referring to. So there's times where I want to step outside of myself and be able to tell this story from, the 1800s, or connect that story from the 1800s to the present. But I'm not going to lie, it gets very heavy because we're still battling so many of these systemic things. And the challenge is also, being able to really handle the fact that in many ways things have changed, but in some ways things have not. And sometimes I have to kind of take that step back and breathe a little bit. Your chest gets a little tight reading some of these horrific things that happened, and being able to tell this story in a way where it's important for us to know, but this is how it's connected to our present, but also in elevating the very positive stories. Look at these things that we've done. Look how we led the largest slave revolt in American history. We descend from that. So what are we able to pull from in the present to make sure that we're laying the foundation for the people that come behind us? So that the biggest challenge for me is really just the emotional aspect of it all, because I really care. So in really caring and kind of oftentimes standing in the middle of history, of the past, and the standing in the present, and also looking to the future, it gets overwhelming sometimes.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I always thought that the more, and I'm still learning this, like the more I learn, the more I like care and become conscious,
Mhm.
the more like lonely I feel, the more heavy I do feel. But I mean, I'm like, now I'm saying like it doesn't have to be a bad thing. It can be an honorable burden to carry. And as long as we create that is radical, that is us
Absolutely.
pushing against everything that people try to do, to
Mhm.
us. But I wanted to get into like a little bit more about the spirituality um of New Orleans. I was watching a documentary a little bit about voodoo, and it
Mhm.
was saying that New Orleans is like the capital for that like spiritual like type of history. Can you talk about Marie Laveau
Mhm.
and a little bit?
So I'll start by saying a lot of times, like, people will come to New Orleans and talk about the heaviness, or like the spirit, or some people say they feel called to New Orleans, or just a lot of people refer to like a spiritual experience when they come to the city. And a lot of times I just say in plain terms, I'm like, it's slavery. That's what it is. Like, in being honest with the fact that New Orleans was once the nation's largest slave market during the domestic slave trade. when you think about the amount of Black people that came through this port at the mouth of the Mississippi River, we are a spiritual people collectively. So when you think about people that are coming from different nations of West Africa and the Caribbean and different parts, different states within the United States, and coming through in New Orleans, a lot of that still lingers here. And it's because of their sacrifice and their contributions and what they had to endure for us to even be here. And honestly, that is a lot of what like these traditions have been birthed out of. It's always going to be rooted in like that resistance, and that like in the face of something that was trying to get in our way. And it makes the story of someone like a Marie Laveau, even though there's no one like her, but Marie Laveau, more incredible, because when you think about a Black woman in 19th century New Orleans who had this city wrapped around her finger and who was able to do what she was able to do at that period of time is incredible. So, yes, we're deemed as like a voodoo city. There's which differentiates from what you think of as like Haitian voodoo, or voodoo that may exist like on the continent. Louisiana voodoo being, its own thing, in addition to the fact that, we have uh a high Black Catholic population in New Orleans, and amongst, Baptist communities and various other religions. But I mentioned slavery first because in understanding that Louisiana was under what they called the Code Noir, the Black codes, in which Catholicism was required. You had to be Catholic no matter what you came here as, or whatever your native religion was. You had to be Catholic. And that is why so many people who have so many strong roots and ties to New Orleans are still Catholic today, myself and my family included. And because of that, you had oftentimes this mix or this blend or this combination of religions, because you working with what you know and you working with what you have. And over time, we've created something that encompasses both. And so, what Marie Laveau was able to do, many people don't realize she was a devout Catholic. She was baptized as Catholic. They said she used to be in the cathedral every Sunday for mass, and while also preserving this tradition of voodoo. And there's been stories, these oral histories of her having an enslaved man, Jean Saint Malo, who was a maroon, a leader of runaway slaves, having a candle on her altar in his honor. And I think that even that is just like an example of like blending of the two. So how often have Black communities across the country taken, our reality, but also like what's our roots, what's our DNA, what's true to us, and created something so beautiful. You go in a Black Catholic church in New Orleans, and you would it would question everything you think you know about Catholicism. And Marie Laveau, I lift her up so often because I think like that's one figure in history where I'm like, I feel like I'm able to like see myself in many ways. And her being able to preserve this religion while at a time where New Orleans had all kind of stuff going on. Like a lot of times people don't realize Marie Laveau lived like from 1801 to like 1888. So she saw a lot. You're thinking about slavery and the Louisiana Purchase and like the Americanization of New Orleans and Louisiana, and different wars and the yellow fever epidemic and emancipation and reconstruction. And she was at work. These are things where, where would we be had she not taken her knowledge of herbs and use that to practice healing for people who were suffering during that epidemic. And it also just puts into context of like, we're not new to disease. We're not new to turmoil or war or violence or anything like that. So Marie Laveau, I think, is a perfect example of like a woman of her time who used what she had to change the moment. And I think that's what we all kind of have a responsibility to do. We didn't went through a pandemic, and Lord, whatever 2016 was with the election, and like, police brutality, anti-Black racism, like there's always something that we go through collectively. But how are we using what we have in this time that we're here to at least try to address those things, and hopefully that somebody can learn from this that follows us.
Absolutely. Girl, okay, so it was a lot. I'm like,
It was a lot. I'm sorry.
it was
I start
no,
talking about her and I just get all over the place.
no, I love it. And I'm sure like the audience is gonna appreciate this too. This history lesson is really dope. Okay, so when I think about New Orleans as well, I think about like the ethnicity cultures that are there that are still Black. Like when I went to Houston, I'm so in LA, it's predominantly Black and Mexican, Black and Latinos, right? I'm Black and Mexican. I'm African American and Mexican. And when I went to Houston, I don't know if maybe mixed people like weren't in abundance there. I don't know. People thought I was Creole, and then I had to ask them like, "What is that?" Can you talk about the Creole culture and how that differentiates from like other Blackness in New Orleans?
So, Creole. This to me, I think it's got to be an article, because there's so many misconceptions and different understandings of this word and this culture, for the simple fact that I really just feel like we needed more than one word to describe what we were saying. Like that's really the basis of it all. So Creole in the simple terms really just meant native to Louisiana. That's how you were identified during the era of slavery especially, but really just pre-Americanization. They needed to be able to identify, were you American born, were you born in Africa, were you native to Louisiana? So that's really what it meant. And after the Louisiana Purchase, that identity became a thing even more so, because it was like, now you have an influx of Americans who are coming in. So now you're really differentiating between Americans from the Creoles who had already been in New Orleans or in Louisiana. And a lot of people today who still are rooted in that culture can trace their lineages back to those people. Black, white, like a lot of people also don't realize that there's Black Creoles, there's white Creoles. Like the term has changed hands over time and changed meanings in different ways, but at its core, it meant native to Louisiana. And you had differences where, to be honest, white people didn't really want to be associated with us. So if you calling yourself a Creole and Black people calling themselves a Creole, it's like, we have to separate ourselves. So that's how you start to kind of have these terms hold different meanings. But that culture is rooted in food, it's rooted in language, it's rooted in place, it's rooted in just the maintaining of certain traditions. A lot of times, a lot of people who identify as Creole are Catholic. And if you think about just the timeline of New Orleans, it makes sense, because if you had to be Catholic at a certain period of time and you descend from that group of people, well, then that's one preservation right there of like, your aspect of Creole is that y'all preserve the religion. And there's definitely certain neighborhoods that are highly related with like Creole culture. The 7th Ward neighborhood of New Orleans, especially the Tremaine neighborhood, and the language piece is something that after the Louisiana Purchase and this desire to Americanize Louisiana, you start seeing the French being taken out of the schools, and the Corey Veni, which is Louisiana Creole, that native tongue, you don't hear it as much anymore. My grandmother used to say like different terms and stuff in Louisiana Creole, and they always talk about how, like, the adults would say it so that the children didn't know what they were saying. and oftentimes referred to as broken French. But, part of the preservation is also that actually it's not broken at all. This was its own language. And if you go in the river parishes of Louisiana, St. John the Baptist Parish, certainly near like Point Coupé and all of these Lafayette area, you'll still hear the language, but it's definitely, it's been on the decline just because it's not something that's necessarily taught in the classrooms or even in the households anymore. The other aspect is, of course, the food. Like, Creole dishes are what's foundational is the Trinity. You have your bell pepper, your onion, and your celery. Some people swap it out with like different things, but that's how I came up on it. And that Trinity seasoning is used in so many different things, from red beans and rice to gumbo to crawfish etouffee. And these are the meals that I grew up on. Like I truly don't think I'd be able to survive somewhere else, because I'm like, I eat red beans every Monday. Like and so being in a place where the people we descend from truly live by the land. We're on the water, so everything is seafood based. And the aspect of a roux, which is the base of a gumbo or etouffee, being so much of what these dishes encompass. And then tapping into really like a diaspora tradition of eating everything over rice. That's huge in New Orleans, but it's huge in Black communities across the globe as well. So much of that culture, there's a mix in the sense that we're on indigenous land at the end of the day. We had Africans who were trafficked to New Orleans, who came and brought their traditions and their contributions and used their knowledge and their will to live in order for us to even be here, and also to even have a culture to hold on to, in addition to the fact that this city was colonized by both the French and the Spanish, and then eventually Americans. So all of these things, whatever the law of the land was at the time, you had those influences. Then you started to see in the late 1900s, early to late 1900s, an influx of immigrants from the Italians, and you had Vietnamese, and you had like Mexican Americans, especially after Hurricane Katrina. So it's there's so much within New Orleans, and there's so much of a culture that exists, and that in some ways changes over time, but that Creole culture is something that is just like at its root, at its core. You can find it being descended from, those early days of New Orleans history. And it's honestly amazing that we've still been able to preserve a lot of those things.
Absolutely, girl. Absolutely. This is a beautiful history lesson. People are gonna love this episode. My teacher, he's a historian, and he's always like, okay, sister, like I like these interviews, and I'm like, you're gonna really like this one, though.
You're really gonna like these.
You're gonna like this one. Okay, so let's go further into our culture. I'm glad you highlighted the positivity that exists in New Orleans culture. Excuse me. What are some of the class issues and cultural issues within the African American community of New Orleans that need to be worked through?
Yeah, so in New Orleans, being a majority Black city, there's still this element of, we know white supremacy finds its way through every aspect of our communities. And because there's still that systemic piece, there are still aspects that still impact our communities because of that. So, everything from, yes, we have these majority Black neighborhoods, but think about how they're segregated, from redlining. Think about which communities had highways constructed straight through it and ultimately, impacted that community. Think about the communities who are in food deserts and don't have or aren't readily accessible to healthy foods or chain restaurants or just things like that, or grocery stores with fresh produce. So there's definitely that element. And then you have the element of in many ways concentrated poverty. You think about how New Orleans had its public housing developments, and we have some very famous public housing developments from the Magnolia for sure. When you start thinking about Cash Money Records and the Calio Project with No Limit and Master P, so there's so much history and so much culture that came out of those housing developments, and they're not even standing now. Like, some have been transformed into mixed income developments because we were the city that got rid of public housing after Katrina. And when you want to start really talking about systemic issues or white supremacy, there was a Republican politician who made a comment, was like, we couldn't get rid of public housing in New Orleans, but God did. Yeah. So that in of itself tells you how what the stereotype or what the view already was of the housing developments, but more so the people that lived in them, because some of them housing developments started out as white residents, and then you started having changes over time and white flight and things like that. And once we get there, suddenly the resources are dwindling away. And a lot of times it was associated with, oh well, this development is falling apart, there's crime here, there's drugs here, whatever. But the reality is that any place that is being deprived of certain resources, you're going to find all of those things. And now what we're seeing is, after tearing down the public housing, only some of those mixed income developments reserved spots for the former residents. And so now you have people that's like, where am I going to go? So, especially at a time where rent is rising in New Orleans. So, speaking to that displacement piece again, you might have grew up in an uptown housing development and you just couldn't go back. And now you're like, okay, where am I going to go? You might now be in a apartment complex that has vouchers in New Orleans East. And if you pair that with New Orleans East being a community that was slow to recover, that isn't really prioritized in terms of resources, you really start to understand how we're viewed as Black people, but specifically how Black people who are experiencing or living in poverty are viewed. They oftentimes get stereotyped as like, there's, poverty becomes simultaneously with crime, when it's like, the resource piece is really what's missing. And so we're seeing this change over time in New Orleans, and it's people are just going from neighborhood to neighborhood. And it's much easier for people to point a finger at, like, this neighborhood used to be bad and now this neighborhood is bad, because where people shifted. Whereas if you really take that dive into the history and the policy changes that have happened, you really start to understand, the changes in class, the changes in crime, and all of these different things. It's like, people need to be where the resources are, and then you wouldn't have any of these problems. So that's definitely one thing that really stands out to me. And at the end of the day, yes, there are Black people living below the poverty line in New Orleans, but guess what? That's where the culture comes from. Those are the people who are out of resistance and out of survival, who have created the things that we love and that honestly our tourism industry is built off of. So if they can't afford to live in New Orleans, what is New Orleans,
I feel you. I feel you. And girl, everything you're saying, it's like, wow, we're going to do this, our own thing up here in LA. Getting pushed out because we can't afford to pay, like I said, my family are South Central natives for almost 80 years very soon, and the fact that their great-great-granddaughter, who, they probably thought they moved their family over here to have a better life from the South, now she's having to go back to the South, because she can't afford, or she's having to do this type of work to preserve our history because Black people can't be here anymore. And think about it. So I'm a producer, filmmaker. I live in Hollywood area. I live in the media capital of the world. And the fact that we can't even be here to tell our stories, for other people to hear, it's like, it's just like it just sounds like we're all kind of going through our own different,
As you see the Hollywood sign, like it's
the Hollywood
crazy.
my house. I can see it in South Central. You could look straight like from like Normandy or Western. That's a street out here. And you can see the Hollywood sign. And I always say that it's crazy how I could see it from my neighborhood, but I never really thought I'd be able to be a part of that,
That's crazy.
Right? Right. Right. Yes.
Whew.
But girl, what do you think happiness is like? Hold on, let me rephrase that question. What does happiness look like for you?
Ooh. To me, happiness feels like peace in a way of I don't think I would truly be at peace or true happiness if I'm the only one experiencing it. I feel like I if I can understand my happiness, my livelihood, my survival being directly tied to the black man up the street, or like that service industry worker who is getting off his shift and suiting up as a black masking Indian to be literally the face of New Orleans' culture. I just, what's that saying? Like, we ain't free till we all free. Is that. And I think that like true happiness for me would be for Black New Orleans to really be in a place where no matter what externally is going on, for us to be in a place where we see ourselves as who we truly are, which is the keepers and the creators of the culture, the the basis of what all of this is built off of. And as long as we know that and can value that internally, I think that will solve so many different problems within our community. And until then, the reason why I feel like I can't know true peace or true happiness, because it's not just enough for me to feel like I'm successful if this is the community that I belong to. And no matter what realm of success we think we sit in, or what class we think we can reach, or what neighborhood we think we can move to, at the end of the day we're all directly tied to each other. So whatever's impacting them over there is going to be you next. So how do we come to a collective understanding to where we're operating from a place of I am you and you are me, and anything that tries to combat that, like, we 10 toes down. We have a united front against that thing that is threatening us. So yes, wishful thinking. But in
Ooh,
general, my happiness also just being able to be in New Orleans. Like I find so much happiness in just being at home, and so many things that fuel me are the same things that give me the desire to want to continue this work. So I
I
am
love
happy.
it. That's how I feel about LA, girl. That's how I feel about LA. If I could just stay here, please. My family could just stay here together and
That's
I'll be all over
beautiful.
the place,
Mm.
Okay. I know we're coming to the end. What would you tell the younger Cierra?
Ooh, it'll all make sense. It might not make sense right now, but it'll all make sense later. Yes.